Let's get started. I'll open us up in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day and for all of your grace in our lives. We pray for your blessing in this class, that you would enliven our minds as we consider these things this morning, and that all that we think about and say and do today would be an honor to you. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we are starting a section on what we have called natural theology. You may remember that from the week on apologetic method. And that is oftentimes associated only with arguments for God's existence. It's broader than that, especially if you take Paul's word seriously in Romans 1:20, that this is the knowledge of God in the things that have been made. So that's what we mean by natural there. In other words, the things in creation, including your own mind, by the way, as we're going to see today, not just things outside of you. But this first of the arguments for God's existence is the ontological argument. Now, I say that in the plural for a reason. Ontological arguments. Because the way I do it is I like to group all of the arguments, and there's innumerable arguments for God's existence, but I like to group them in 5 different families of arguments. I think it's the neatest way to do it and still include a lot of them. There's overlap. But this first one, the ontological argument, was made famous by this guy Anselm, so we'll talk about him and his argument for about a third of the time, maybe about a half of the time. That's our first point right there. And then we'll look at it in the modern world and then the late modern world, like in the last couple of generations, people have tinkered with the argument. Now, where does the argument come from before I get to it, as far as the word? Where does that? A lot of these words actually come from Kant, which is not helpful, but he gave us these words, and so it's fine to use the word, but it comes from the word being in the Greek, ontos, and so it's going to have to do with the being of God. But in this case, it's maybe slightly misleading because it's the idea of God's being. And as I said, it was Anselm of Canterbury that made the argument famous. He lived at the turn of the 11th going into the 12th century, so the 1000s going into the 1100s. He was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's the one that famously gave us this argument. It was, I don't want to say revived, but given other additions in the early modern era by René Descartes. We mentioned him briefly, so rationalist versions of the argument, which is part of what makes people think that it's a rationalist thing. And then some other guys in the 20th century that we'll talk about. One more thing before we get started. The most basic way of dividing the arguments for God's existence are, we mentioned in our week on logic the difference between deductive reasoning from general principles or axioms or premises to particular conclusions, and then inductive reasoning, I just like to use hand signals to make it easy, from particular bits of data, and then we form general categories from that. Well, kind of along those lines, sort of, are these two kinds of arguing for God's existence, and we use the language from the Latin, a priori, in other words, prior to, and in this case, it's experience. An a priori line of reasoning is one where I have an idea and I see what else must be true, what follows from that general idea. In other words, I'm not working from my experience of things, I'm working from some deductive principle. An a posteriori argument, a posteriori, think of posterior, but it's after. In this case. So after experience, you're working from things, maybe think of things in the world, evidence, that can become misleading, but it's just a general framework that people have when they use these kind of arguments. Well, this one, the ontological argument, is the one of the 5 kinds that is a priori. It works from an idea to what else must follow. So, That's for the nerds out there, but not really. I mean, it's helpful to know. Okay, so here's Anselm. I'm told that's exactly what he looked like. Probably not. He was a monk too, don't forget. And in fact, he's coming up with this argument in a monastery. That's kind of the idea, the backdrop, is that his monk friends said, "Hey, Anselm, we know a bunch of skeptics. And we want to know what we can know about the existence of God. So he writes this one book, the Monologion, and then some other guy who we're going to talk about in a second objects to it. He writes another one, the Proslogion. These are weird words, but just go with them. And he develops this idea as a kind of meditation, kind of like Augustine's Confessions. But as he's meditating to God, he derives this idea of God, and then he sees what will follow it. Okay? And here's how he starts. He starts out with a scripture verse. By the way, some presuppositionalists, John Frame would be one, will kind of adopt Anselm a little bit and say, he's a token presuppositionalist, actually. Because he's starting with scripture, or really, to not straw man their view, he's starting from an idea of God. It's what Gordon Clark would have called dogmatic, but it's also not a rationalistic idea. Some people have said that Anselm is a rationalist, but these guys would say, no, he's actually starting from God. He's presupposing God. And then he's drawing out what else must be true about him. Well, that's not quite what he's doing here, not yet. He's reciting this verse from Psalm 14:1. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. But in his next breath, he says to himself, but even the fool has in his mind an understanding of what I mean when I say that there is a being than which none greater can be conceived. That's a weird jumble of words, isn't it? Let me say it again. Even the fool has in his mind an understanding of what I mean when I say that there is a being, there must be a being, I have an idea of being, than which none greater can be conceived. Now, if that is kind of backward sounding for you, I invented a way to say it. Greatest conceivable being, or GCB. That's the way I put it for the kids. So they understand what I'm saying because it's a mouthful. But that's what he's saying. He has the idea in his mind of a being that I can't think of a greater being. And let's suppose I did. Well, then that being would be a greater being, and thus the greatest conceivable being. So that makes up Anselm's first premise. We all have the idea of such a being. Now, if you say, well, my idea is different than your idea, one response he could give is, well, keep going. Or I'll keep going. Share with me this greater idea. Now, some basic first arguments against this can be imagined easily enough. You could simply say, no, I don't have such an idea, and I certainly reject yours. Now, on a slightly more sophisticated level, someone could object and say, well, you're just defining God that way to begin with. How convenient. So this is going to be a circular argument, Anselm. Your definition of God is one who, I know where this is going, he's one who must exist. And then you argue from there that such a one does exist. Well, of course, but that's circular. And so the early question you have to wrestle with is this: why should any of us accept Anselm's definition to begin with? Well, one key word that you really want to seize on that really captures this idea is the idea of limitlessness. So when you think of the infinity of God, don't think of numbers or different kinds of infinity or spatial things or anything like that. Think simply of limitless. No limit. By greatest conceivable being, we mean a being without limitation in anything that he possesses. What some philosophers have called, and we're going to run into this phrase later, great-making properties. Now, I don't particularly care for that way of expressing it because you can get the idea that God is made up of. So you have the idea of parts or an arrangement of pieces. You're starting to understand his attributes like that. And some would have never talked that way but 20th century theistic philosophers will say that. Nevertheless, in spite of it being a sloppy, mischievous way to say it, still, the idea here is that this being in all that I'm thinking of is maximally, limitlessly great. William Lane Craig puts it like this. He says, God is the greatest conceivable being. This is true by definition. For if we can conceive of something greater than God, then that would be God. So in other words, if you have a failure to track with this, that's part of what will suggest it. Keep going, in other words. Now, that can be helpful, but it could also lead to another objection, which I'll get to in a bit. But the very definition of the idea of God, and this is all I'm doing right now, is listing this first premise. The very definition of the idea of God in the mind is then followed by a series of inferences, which I will get to. I will quote Anselm first. This is the second premise and how he draws the inference, but I guess I'm going to read the quote first, which is a mouthful. It's risky, because what I was hoping for is to bring this in first. But let's get to the way Anselm says it first, which will be helpful. And I put in bold the key things, and remember as I read this, your law of non-contradiction, which was what? A does not equal non-A, or in layman's terms, a thing cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same relation. So if you remember that and firmly fix it in your mind, now you're ready to hear where Anselm goes next. He says, and assuredly, that than which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. Let me stop right there. Up until this point, you may have thought to yourself, well, I agree with that, but that's not going to prove anything to anybody because all you have is an idea. I know. Anselm would have said, I know. But watch what follows. That then which nothing greater can be conceived cannot exist in the understanding alone. For suppose it exists in the understanding alone, then it can be conceived to exist in reality, which is greater. Therefore, if that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, the very being than which nothing greater can be conceived is one than which a greater can be conceived. But obviously this is impossible. Don't worry, I'll go back to it because you might have missed it. But obviously this is impossible. Hence there is no doubt that there exists a being than which nothing greater can be conceived, and it exists both in the understanding and in reality. When I taught this to the kids, I drew on the chalkboard a head, as I always do in these situations, and a puffy cloud, which was his idea, and then GCB inside the idea. And at this point you're thinking, yes, greatest conceivable being, I can think of that, but that's just an idea. Then outside of his mind, I wrote again GCB. What Anselm is saying is that if you can think of the greatest conceivable being, you will grant, at least, that a being which exists independent of your mind would be greater than a being that exists only dependent on your mind. Would you agree to that? And everybody said, well, yes, if, I know, wait for it. If that's true, then what follows, if you agree to those two premises, that than which nothing greater can be conceived exists in the understanding alone, if you want to hold to that idea, in other words, you're tracking with the idea, you're tracking that that would be greater. So now if you say that I have the idea, but it's only in my mind, then what follows is that you have a being than which none greater can be conceived, and a being than which something greater can be conceived. Namely, it's not the same being. So I highlighted these words, nothing greater, and then that same being, in other words, at the same time in the same relationship, a greater can be conceived. Now, to most people today, especially if you have no background in logic and metaphysical thinking just doesn't do anything for you because you're just a product of the past 4 or 5 generations of naturalists. And by that I include most Christians. We've absorbed naturalism in our thinking. We really feel it when somebody says, I'll believe it when I see it, or seeing is believing, which it's totally not. Seeing is seeing, believing is believing, and so on and so forth. Well, we like explosions. Our attention spans have been shot over the past several generations of pop culture and that kind of thinking, that when typically, I think I can speak for 90% of people when they run into this in freshman philosophy class, if they teach it at all, or in an apologetics class, is that you'll see that and you'll say, that's clever, but still sounds like a magic trick. I don't think that proves anything, because by thing you're again thinking of stuff, chalk, stuff I can feel and smell and taste and touch and so forth. And so you have to really stare at it. Like, what is this even saying? Well, let's map it out, as we have been with some other arguments, in terms of some deductive logic. And we'll stay simple at first. Don't look at that yet. Just the first bit that we've looked at. So don't look at that and don't look at that yet. Just in terms of two premises and a conclusion. This is what we've seen so far in Anselm's idea. There is a greatest conceivable being. And if it helps, just say, there is an idea. We have an idea of a greatest conceivable being, so that we're not claiming too much there. Second premise, mind-independent existence is greater than mind-dependent existence. In other words, if this being existed outside of all of our minds, doesn't depend on our minds, well then obviously that's the real thing versus just an idea. Therefore, the greatest conceivable being exists independent of our minds. The very definition of it, you've agreed, it would have to exist independent of our minds. In other words, in reality, and not just as an idea. Well, nobody, in the terms of people that study philosophy, nobody doubts that premise 2 and the conclusion are exactly what Anselm meant. There's much controversy, though, over what was really meant by the first premise. In other words, is this really ontology we're doing here, being, or is this conceptualism? If something is possible, and if it's great in some way, poof, it becomes true. There's a lot of misunderstanding about that. Well, let's leave that aside for a moment and just proceed with the proof. The strongest version of this argument can be stated as what's called a reductio ad absurdum. I mentioned that once, I can't remember what week, but let me just explain it again in layman's terms. You have a deductive argument, and you have what is your conclusion, what you want to show. But you have an opponent, and so you take that conclusion and you reverse it, and you start a new part of the argument. In other words, you take your opponent's position and you take it for a test drive. And you draw out its absurdity by showing a contradiction that results if his position is correct. So if your position is the greatest conceivable being exists independent of our mind, the contrary would be the greatest, or the contradictory proposition would be the greatest conceivable being does not exist independent of our minds. And you can see that even though I'm helping Anselm here, he did say this in the middle of his argument. He was kind of using a reductio ad absurdum, and he's saying, okay, let's say you want to say this, let's see what follows. So we take our conclusion, we state the opposite, and we show that it is inherently illogical. So you have there is a greatest conceivable being. 2, mind-independent existence is greater than mind-dependent existence. Our original conclusion, the greatest conceivable being exists independent of our minds. But now we have this contradictory proposition. So what followed from that? If we allow both that extra mental existence is greater than merely mental existence, and if at the same time we insist that this being exists only in the mind, what follows? What follows is the greatest conceivable being, this is at the bottom, exists independent of our minds and does not exist independent of our minds at the same time and in the same relationship. Since that is self-contradictory, the argument is impossible to the contrary. Now, if I was a preceptor at this point, I would say the impossibility of the contrary, which oftentimes shows that they don't know what that means or are just kind of repeating that. But it's a very Aristotelian concept. I won't go into the specifics of it, but just as a matter of common sense, you can kind of see, well, if this is false in the sense that it's impossible, then its opposite is necessary. You see that? If it has an opposite. Now, it doesn't work in some things. You say, well, a square circle is impossible. That must mean that the opposite of a square circle is logically necessary. Well, what's the opposite of a square circle, right? So it doesn't work in some things. So the temptation maybe is to think that it doesn't work about everything. But I would say that's not the case. If you have something that the law of the excluded middle applies to, A or non-A, existence of God or non-existence of God, and so forth, and you have a situation where if that proposition is logically impossible, then its opposite is logically necessary. So Anselm has here a logical proof. It is necessarily the case. It cannot be untrue. What Anselm is saying is that the very idea of God, let me say it the other way, the very non-existence of God is logically, I'm going to go Inigo Montoya on you, inconceivable. And I think that's the problem for a lot of people too. Well, we just haven't conceived of it yet. Or maybe there's some shortage in your mind, or maybe all of our minds. But that, again, this is why logic should have never been taken out of schools, is not what's happening here. This is a logical proof. It cannot be gotten around. Now, you have to state it a certain way. And there's questions about as to what exactly Anselm meant here. Now, there was an early objection to this. And this will start to draw out what Anselm did mean, didn't mean, or what maybe we could mean to make it better if we want to. And that was this guy, Gunilla. Also looked exactly like that. And he wrote a letter to Anselm, and he called it On Behalf of the Fool, because he wanted to sort of poke at how Anselm was using Psalm 14:1 and how he got going. Because at the end of the day, the crux of the argument is, you have the idea. And so here's what I'm going to do. This island here, I'm going to treat as Anselm's mind. Because that's really what Canilla's doing. He's saying, so you're saying that if I just have the idea of the greatest possible, so I have the idea of the greatest possible island. It's got everything. It's got perfect palm trees, perfect beaches, their servants bringing me pina colada, whatever. I've got this idea, and according to your logic, it is greater to exist outside of the mind than merely inside of the mind. Therefore, you get the idea. Well, what's the problem with this? Remember that word limitless. Are seashores limitless? Or isn't it the very concept of a seashore a limitation? And you can say the same thing about coconuts and trees and lawn chairs and inhabitants of islands and so forth. Or is there something different going on with the attributes of God? But Ganilla's saying, well, no, you've slyly, this is a card trick. You've moved from the existence of an idea to the existence of the thing that corresponds to the idea. So one of the reasons I went into that idea of limitlessness is to head us off at the pass here. Okay? But you might think, well, it's still, I almost sympathize with this guy, because that's all I got out of it. And that might be you, and that's fine. Well, this is a great statement in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. By the way, the imposing nature of this argument, if it's not imposing to you, it is to secular philosophers, even as they attempt to refute it. They still do have to do business with it because they recognize there's something here that they can't get around. They're not quite sure what it is sometimes. But here's what the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says about a concept called intrinsic maximums. Remember I said the maximum of power, the maximum of God's attributes. You say the maximum of coconuts. Now I'm thinking of a linear line of discrete objects on a number line. It's a very different thing. Or the seashore expanding more. Is that the same sort of thing that we're talking about when we talk about power and holiness and infinity and so forth? Okay? So, intrinsic maximums. This is what it says. Properties like knowledge, power, and moral goodness, which comprise the concept of a maximally great being, do have intrinsic maximums. I'm only reading you a snippet. In other words, he's saying coconuts don't. For example, perfect knowledge requires knowing all and only true propositions. It is conceptually impossible to know more than this. So you see what it means by intrinsically maximum. Likewise, perfect power means being able to do everything that is possible to do. It is conceptually impossible for a being to be able to do more than this. Now you can say, well, Anselm didn't follow through on this. I think his argument is valid and sound, but he didn't have some of these words that contemporary philosophers do. He didn't even use the language specifically of the law of non-contradiction like you did, Matt, so I think you're maybe giving him a crutch. My response to that is, so what? It's not the job of us to study these things in the museum of historical thought and to say, well, I can knock down the Anselm pin or the Aquinas pin or whatever else, and I've done my job. No, we want to see the fullness of what the form of the argument is. Now, speaking of Aquinas, you may be interested to know that Aquinas himself rejected Anselm's argument. He had problems with it too. For example, the role of the fool. In his mind, there's abundance of people who don't understand God by this idea or don't understand the idea at all. So Aquinas talked about the idea of what is self-evident, and there's different kinds of a thing being self-evident. And the psalm means what it says. There are people who, at least on a conscious level, deceived, but do think this. But actually, Aquinas had another objection, Anselm, that'll set us up to strengthen up the case. Aquinas said that even if we concede that the argument's valid, the first premise is still unsound, because the concept of infinity, where is that? Right over here. That in there, limitlessness in that greatest, the concept of infinity in that greatest conceivable far exceeds our grasp. Okay. So did anybody ever improve, I hate saying it like that, improve upon it? Before we get to Descartes and his argument formally, let's see what he said. This is in his discourse on method. I briefly mentioned in passing the very famous, I think, therefore I am. Well, the next step in that very argument was an ontological argument for God's existence. And so he says this, from his rationalist starting point, from I think, therefore I am. So I am a thinking thing. I don't need my body. I'm simplifying this. There is an extended world, a bodily world, but I'm starting here. So he says, from this, I knew that I was a substance, the whole essence or nature of which is simply to think. Thus this I, this self, that is to say, the soul through which I am what I am, is entirely distinct from the body and is even easier to know than the body. And even if there were no body at all, it would not cease to be all that it is. Now he starts from that perspective of some idea and him as the idea constructor, the thinking thing. And there's a lot of objections you can imagine to even how he starts. But for our purposes, the one that might come to your mind most naturally is, okay, how do you get from your own mind to God? Or is it, do you go back to the external world to God, as they traditionally did? And the answer is both are in play. So the internal way, and yes, Descartes looked a lot like Inigo Montoya, for anybody that wants to know. These are more accurate pictures. But here's one way to summarize. This is literally, I went through this page and I reduced it down to this. I think it's an accurate way to describe where he goes. He says, number one, a mind is greater which knows than a mind which doubts. Okay. A mind that knows is greater than a mind that doubts. At least it's greater in knowledge. You might think, well, is he talking IQ? That's not where he's going, actually. He's just saying the mind as a knowing, doing its job, knowing is greater than not knowing. Let's go with that. Secondly, a mind which knows all is perfect. A mind which does not, imperfect. That's fairly uncontroversial. 3, doubt is the opposite of knowing, an imperfection of mind. Okay, according to the standard he had in premise 1, that follows. For I doubt, Descartes noticed, I am a doubting being. And he can't deny that because that's how he got here, by doubting everything to get to himself. Therefore, I am an imperfect mind. So where does he go from there? Well, if I have the idea of a perfect mind, from where did I derive the idea of a perfect mind if my mind which doubts is imperfect and I am not that mind? Now, that's good so far. But then he cheats. Then he goes back to the external world and says that God would never deceive us. I agree. But Descartes just spent the past 6 or 7 pages doubting the external world and his senses and things like that. So apparently, maybe God or maybe some evil demon or something, maybe we're in the Matrix, did deceive me. So he kind of cheats a little bit and he cuts off the branch that he's sitting on. So we're not too worried about him. But just so you know, Descartes is another that came up with an idea. And I would say that this argument is not as good as Anselm's for that very reason. But he looks at all the attributes of such a mind that must be perfect, and he notices that it must be infinite, eternal, unchanging, all-knowing, and even all-powerful. So he starts to deduce all these different attributes of God. Now, whether or not you buy into him cheating or being able to do that, it's another story. So it's difficult to assess this argument. And it's also difficult reading back into these older thinkers because they don't state it in a technical way like we would tend to do today. But he uses other arguments to show that God has to be necessary in a similar way to the fact that triangles have a necessary aspect about them. Now, Descartes is a geometer. He's a mathematician. He's like, I don't know if there's any triangles in the world. This doesn't prove that. But if there's a triangle, then it has to be 3 sides. And he draws out other dimensions of it and so forth. And so that leads to one of the modern objections against the ontological argument, and that is that you're saying things that must be necessary about this being, but you still haven't established that there is a single triangle in the world, simply because it must be this, and then they apply that same thing to God's being. Now, the most famous objection to the ontological argument comes from Immanuel Kant. And you'd be interested to know that Kant was not directly dealing with Anselm. He was dealing with the rationalist version of that. It's typically what they do between Hume and Kant, who are credited with killing natural theology, but in fact, all they were doing was arguing against people near to them in their day. So they were kind of dealing with this second-hand, second-rate versions of the argument. And for Kant, he was dealing with Descartes and more immediately a guy named Christian Wolff, nearer to him, who's giving a rationalist version of the ontological argument. But what he does is basically this. You're saying that you have the idea of a greatest conceivable being. And you're saying that the idea of him being implies that he must exist, that he has existence as a necessary property or predicate. But hold on just a minute. Existence, or being, isn't a property. It isn't a predicate. You either are or you aren't. That you are doesn't add a single thing to what you are. It just is a way of saying that you are. And there's arguments against that I find persuasive. But the bigger problem with it is going to be the difference between mere existence versus what the argument's actually getting at, which is necessary existence. But a lot of people were very, very persuaded by Kant's reasoning and began to discredit the ontological argument. You didn't hear about it for about 100 years, and then it gets revived in the 20th century, and now everybody's realizing that maybe Kant missed a spot. Necessary existence. This is the key. And again, even the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy catches this. It says, for example, if X, whatever X is, necessarily exists, then its existence does not depend on the existence of any being, unlike contingent human beings whose existence depends, at the very least, on the existence of their parents. And this seems to entail that X has the reason for its existence in its own nature. Edwards Very briefly, I wish it was more. I will say this. Of all the things in that wonderful book, Classical Apologetics, that Sproul, Gerstner, and Lindsley wrote, this is the one that I think comes with the most false advertising. It's true what they say about Edwards, but then you read the sources and you're like, that's it? Yeah, I was hoping for like a page or 2 or 3, but no, it's just these 2 little statements. One comes from his Miscellanies, which he wrote when he was 21. Most 21-year-olds are like playing Xbox and drinking Red Bull and stuff. And Jonathan Edwards was writing philosophical treatises, which are still with us. And the other comes from this sort of parenthetical, just, oh, by the way, while I'm giving you this other brain bender about the will, I'll just drop in this little footnote about necessary being. That book, you got to read in a log cabin somewhere with a coffee and nobody anywhere around you, and lots of aspirin, and just spend like a day on each page, because you got to think. And what Edwards does is he's looking at the shift from the focus of the idea of this being to the reality of this being. So that when we speak of the impossibility of this being's non-existence, we're no longer speaking of our capacities to conceive, we're speaking of the necessity of the being itself, that it is unthinkable because it is in itself impossible that such being not exist. Again, we only know about this from Edwards because these 2 little parenthetical statements in these 2 books. But Edwards does not begin with the idea of being, pointing out that we can't have the idea of non-being. He does say that, he says it very colorfully, to think of nothing belongs to sleeping rocks. You ever hear that statement from Edwards? To think of nothing belongs to sleeping rocks. It's just his funny way to say, you cannot think of nothing. I know people claim to do that. Bertrand Russell one time said, I can. No, you can't. You're thinking of a white room. You're thinking of a blank space, and by space you have spatial dimensions and so forth. But he moves beyond our mind. Edwards says, it would be in itself the greatest absurdity to deny the existence of being in general, or to say that there was absolute and universal nothing. Now, there's a kind of ontological argument which plays up that angle and says that if at any time there ever was nothing, then nothing ever would be. An atheist then replies, yes, but the universe, and he'll do this on several of these, the first 2 arguments for sure, but the universe itself can be a candidate for that. And I call that the cosmic popcorn machine, because it's always coming in and out of existence, because I think even a naturalist would grant that everything in the physical universe is contingent, is changing, and so forth, deteriorating. We'll get to those sort of things when we look at science. But by being in general, he doesn't mean something generalized. That's the first mistake I think the atheist retort is making. But the authors of Classical Apologetics summarize the, I'll say, potential improvement Edwards could have made, would be a more realistic way to say it, in this way. They said Anselm, at least implicitly, shows that we cannot not think of being. Edwards shows that we cannot think of non-being. Anselm shows that being must be. Edwards, that non-being must not, cannot be. Since non-being cannot be, it cannot be conceived. Just as since being cannot not be, its non-being cannot be conceived. Therefore, we cannot think of being not being ever or anywhere. And they quote Psalm 139, 7 and 8. And you would think, well, that's just about the omnipresence of God. But of what? But his being. He's not and being is not a thing tacked on to God. It is what he is. So they say, consequently, this eternal, infinite being must necessarily exist because we cannot think of it not existing. And the only ultimate proof of the existence of anything is that we cannot think of it not existing ever. Now, what you mean by ultimate proof, I might take issue with that. At any rate, Edwards' next step is instructive, actually, for how natural theology informs our theology as a whole. I don't have this quote up there, but Edwards said, "Therefore, the only way that anything that is to come to pass hereafter is or can be necessary is by a connection with something that is necessary in its own nature, or something that already is or has been." That's an important quote, which maybe I'll bring up later, and I wrestled with this, whether I should include Thomas Aquinas' third way in this week, but I won't, because it's a kind of ontological argument talking about, there are contingent things and necessary things, but even of things that we call necessary, there are things that are not absolutely necessary. But then there must be something which has its necessity in itself, not a necessity that's derived from something else. We'll come back to that one just because we're already overloaded this week. Final way to state the argument was by one who followed in Edwards' theology and his neck of the woods a century later, W.G.T. Shedd. He said this: "The human mind possesses the idea of an absolutely perfect being, that is, of a being than whom a more perfect cannot be conceived." So you see, he uses that Anselmian language there. "But such perfection as this implies necessary existence, and necessary existence implies actual existence, because if a thing must be, of course, it is." So the classical formulation of this by Anselm, even into the modern world, might need some fine-tuning, but it definitely does not need an overhaul, and that's what's going to happen in this last part I'm going to talk about briefly. But as we've said before, this is really the key concept. Since the non-existence of necessary being violates the law of non-contradiction, therefore God necessarily exists. So God has so ordered and, you might say, wired the human mind as to torture the atheist with this logic. Now, for that very reason, we've talked about Romans 1:18. We suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Thus, you have all of the clever attempts to get away from these things. But when you do hone in on this and you actually look at this logic, you're looking at something very, very uncomfortable because it can't be gotten around. Very briefly, I said it doesn't need an overhaul. Some people disagree with me. So you have these theistic philosophers in the last generation, and even before Alvin Plantinga, you had guys whose names are probably not widely known. Charles Hartshorne, partly because he was not an open theist, but a process theologian. And Norman Malcolm, another guy, that came up with newer forms of the ontological argument. More famous than them is the theistic philosopher, Christian philosopher, Alvin Plantinga. And he uses, and they use, language borrowed from further developments in philosophy, in particular modal logic and modality. I'm not going to torture you with that, but I'll just torture you with one thing that you've probably heard me say before, but not know what it comes from. Have you ever heard the language of possible worlds? And you think, sci-fi, multiverses. No, that's not what it means. A possible world is just a whole set of data, or what's called states of affairs. In other words, things, stuff, events, people, real things. But they're possible. So we are theists, so we can talk like this comfortably. All the possibilities in God's mind that could have been, those setups, those parts of worlds, even if all you're talking about is the church service this morning, everything that goes on here, that would represent a possible world, even though it's connected to the actual world that we live in all other respects. But that state of affairs would be treated as its own possible world. Why do they do this? To torture us? Yes, probably. But no, it actually draws out the modes in which something can exist. Its possibility, its necessity, its impossibility, its contingency. It just makes us more precise in our language. So it has value. The problem is when these guys don't root themselves in the past and they think they're going to improve in a radical way and go down the roots and give us something totally new. But they notice that the ontological argument is being talked about again, and so they want to give it a facelift. And this is actually from a really good video. Let me give credit so that this doesn't get taken off of YouTube or something. I nabbed this from somebody, okay? It's a good video. It's a little 3-minute video, the Center for Philosophy of Religion. I think it's connected to Plantinga, actually. And it does a really good job in 3 minutes of just giving it. Starts in a library. And these, by the way, are books. You probably can't see it very well because these things are covering it. But these are books. And he's in the library, and this book represents a story with possible things in it. This book represents the actual world. And in its pages, it makes claims and says a bunch of things are true. And that red one in the right upper corner represents the actual world. Of course, an actual world has to be in the set of possible worlds, right? Because if it's actual, well, then everything in it has to have been possible. There can't be any square circles or married bachelors in the actual world because there aren't any in any possible world either. Make sense? Okay. So there's no four-sided triangles in any possible world. They're all three-sided triangles because the opposite's impossible. So anyway, I'll skip some of that stuff just to get to planting his idea. The claim of this modal, newer ontological argument is that a maximally excellent being, which is just another way to say Anselm's greatest conceivable being, must exist in all possible worlds. And as a corollary to this, such a being has to possess all of his perfections in all possible worlds. And you say, well, that's just a Christian theistic, but remember what I said last week when somebody says, you're just defining God that way. Always respond by saying, yeah, I know. And you have an interest, unless you want to make a fool of yourself in front of these people, of refuting my idea. Because until you've refuted my idea, you haven't refuted the one that's sitting right in front of you. And secondly, if you're going to be an honest person at all, you know that if you want to refute a Christian theistic idea of God, you have to refute the God who all of his attributes are what he is, unchangingly. Okay? So that's not some convenience. That's the God we're defending, and you haven't touched it unless you've refuted that one. And so, on the other hand, they say that nor would a maximally excellent being have been different had things in a different world been different. Because, of course, God, all that is in God, has to be necessary in all possible worlds. So Plantinga argues it like this, and this is as concise as I can make it. And it kind of takes on this form in one of his books. Number one, it is possible that there is a being that has maximal greatness. So right there, you're right where Anselm started. I have the idea. There's a being that has maximal greatness. I'll just end with this, by the way. Two, so there is a possible being that in some world, this is what they do, they use letters to symbolize what they're talking about, W for world. There's a possible being that in some world, W, let's call it, has maximal greatness. Three, a being has maximal greatness in a given world only if it has maximal excellence in every world. Because the whole point of it is that this will show a little bit more why, and I think it's why he adds it. Four, a being has maximal excellence in a given world only if it has omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection in that world. Here's one problem right away I can say. That's true, but why? You haven't told us why. Why are these necessary? And Plantinga can't go there unless he just starts going back to the traditional arguments for God's existence. Now, why are they doing this anyway? I can tell you why Plantinga is doing this. Because this is, if you look at it and you watch the video, you're like, okay, so if a being in any possible world is maximally great, if he's necessary to that world, then for that same reason, he's necessary to every possible world. But since the actual world's a possible world, then he's also necessary to the actual world. Okay, that's great. That's a great way to go around what Anselm's already said and say it. The added disadvantage there is that you haven't proven why these in particular are necessary to every possible world. You can, but you haven't. No coincidence, and the video won't tell you this, I don't want to burst its bubble, but Plantinga in every one of his books, including this one, will tell you at the end, now is this a valid and sound argument? Yeah. Does it prove God's existence? Probably not. And that's total Plantinga, and that's why I don't come from a reformed epistemological method of apologetics. I only briefly touched on it. Here's one reason. You won't find this dominating apologetics because the whole thing is designed to not do what apologetics was meant to do. I won't go into the specifics of it, but it is a form of fideism, as presuppositionalism is. Presuppositionalism and reformed epistemology are both forms of fideism that just take the scenic route, where you could pretend you're doing Apologetics, but you wind up at the same place, giving this elaborate reason of why we shouldn't speak about all things in an authoritative way over the unbeliever. And I will stop there. If that last 5-10 minutes doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it, because it's an inferior form of the argument anyway. So let me open it up to questions, comments. I did better this week, you'll notice, at ending on time. So I have 10 whole minutes. Yep.
Wouldn't the problem be with point 4 there, that he has the maximal excellence, and he may have the omnipotence and omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, whatever, moral perfection, but the issue becomes one of how is it applied?
Yeah, how does it show, how can you show how those are necessary to every possible world? Now I think you can. And we'll see the moral perfection part when we look at the moral argument. We'll see the omniscience part when we look at the epistemological argument in 2 weeks. And omnipotence, you can kind of show in other ways, starting next week with the cosmological argument. But this argument by itself hasn't done any of that. He's rightly assuming that those are necessary to this being necessary, but he's not demonstrating why or how that is the case, which I'm not surprised by, because that's kind of what his method does everywhere it goes. Yeah. Yeah.
Go back to your Stanford philosophical, way back, the first one after Anselm.
Did I? There.
Yeah.
Yep.
Here it says, requires knowing all and only true propositions. Would not false propositions also have to be known?
Right. Yeah. That is an inferior way to state it, the way they did. My only guess is that they're trying not to be pedantic, because I think they're trying to be concise. Maybe I'm being too charitable, but you're right. They would have to know. It's a bit like when people are confused. Well, how can God know sin, or how can God know that which is not, and so forth? And they're making a fundamental mistake, and it's the same mistake you're hitting on. Yes, he would have to know all false propositions, meaning he would have to know that the false propositions are and that they are false, but he would not know them as if they were true. He would not know false propositions as true. He would know false propositions as false. So yeah, to be more complete, they should have said that. Yeah. Any buzzer beaters? And we don't even have a buzzer. We did good today. We got 3 or 4 minutes. Yep.
So it's been a few years since I thought through the ontological arguments. Since my freshman year of college, actually.
Yeah.
Which was only a few years ago, anyways. But from my understanding, with I think it's Ganilo, how do you say his name? Yeah. With his argument, the reason why it falls short is essentially that, like, I guess I'm trying to think through it more so that's a question, but I kind of have a question in there. Mm-hmm. Basically, the problem, like, I guess that you would say, and how Anselm would respond, because it's also been a bit since I've read Anselm's response to that as well, is essentially that, well, an island, or, we want to do something more contemporary, say, like, the greatest conceivable, like, pink unicorn, what are some of his attributes? He's pink, he has a glorious horn, he runs really fast. The reason why there are problems with, like, something like that, right, and the island, in contrast to God, is that God, by definition, has no limits, whereas by very definition, an idol, or like something, or like an island, not an idol, an island, or like a unicorn, by default, by its very nature, does have limitations, and so you can't really say this is the greatest conceivable island, because even in its greatness, it doesn't have all the attributes of God, like infinity and all these other things, and so that's the reason why that falls short. Would that be kind of how Anselm would respond to that?
Yeah, it is, and also the necessary existence versus mere existence, but that would just get right back to limitlessness or maximalization. I think
let's push back to, like, necessary existence being an attribute.
Right. They'll fall back to that, because I think if you say that, a lot of atheists would say, okay, I see the difference about a beach and the trees and all that versus what you say are attributes of God, but they'll say either, but you're just defining God that way up front, and I'll respond the way I respond. Or they'll, if they know about the Kantian objection, which of course most people don't, so most people won't go there. That's kind of the good news. But if they do, then we have to be aware of some of those things that go a little bit deeper. But that's one of them, necessary existence versus existence per se. Yep.
I've just noticed that there seems to be a bit of equivocation, if you will, between being and greatest thing.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, Anselm's talking about the island, the greatest thing.
Right.
A being is not a thing. In fact, God is not a created thing. God is a spirit. God is.
Mm-hmm. That gets into more of the story of language. I would say language devolving, but just regardless, language changing meaning. When the older thinkers prior to the 20th century, certainly, but probably have to go back behind the 18th century for this, they would use being and thing, res in the Latin